Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wikistrat podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Bibhu Routray and Dr. Harsh Pant. Dr. Routray is the director of Mantraya.org. Previously, he served as the deputy director in India's National Security Council Secretariat in New Delhi. Dr. Parsh is a professor of international relations in the Defense Studies Department in the India Institute at King's College London. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today and for sharing your time. And I want to dive right into it. And could each of you give us a quick overview of the current iteration of the India-China conflict? What are the key factors that we need to understand? Bibhu, can we start with you? Thank you.
Well, at the moment, we're looking at a very sort of precarious situation. Since August 2020, almost 50,000 troops on India's side and almost the same number of troops on the other side, facing one another with lots of arms and ammunition, weapon systems. So probably we're closest to a no war, no peace kind of a situation. Well, India thinks, actually both think that the situation can be brought under control, but there are different sort of objectives. China probably wants to convert the LAC, the line of control, actual control, which it occupies now, into probably the actual LAC. India wants China to go back and restore LSE as it was in April 2020. Negotiations have failed. Negotiations are still continuing, but more than what's happening between these two countries, India is reaching out to its supporters, its allies, its friends, and hoping that the kind of pressure that can generate globally will sort of force China to go back. But that also looks like a remote possibility, because over time, China's position has become more belligerent. So that's the situation that India is staring at. Nobody knows how it's going to evolve, and it will be a long haul.
Mm-hmm.
That's my take.
Thank you, Bibhu. Harsh, to you.
Yeah, I think a lot of what has been said is actually the reality on the ground. What we are looking at is an incredibly dynamic situation across the LAC. And I think what has happened is that the line of actual control, which is the undemarcated border between India and China, along which there have always been contestation because it is undemarcated, it is undefined. There are different perceptions of LAC. So it was always, the dispute was always there. But from the dispute which was being handled diplomatically, the two countries are now in a situation where their armies, militaries are facing off each other. And I think this is for the first time in several decades that shots are being fired. It used to be, compared to the LOC line of control with Pakistan, the boundary with China used to be, or it was claimed that it was extremely stable. It was indeed stable. There were no major skirmishes. There was no use of weaponry along the border for the last several decades. That was the result of a lot of confidence building measures that have been in place. But what we are seeing since April is there are two aspects. One, China's encroachment on what India claims to be in its territory, and the idea that China feels emboldened enough to encroach upon Indian territory and then demand that India come to the negotiating table. India has taken an equally hardline position, saying that now not only is the boundary issue at dispute, but also the larger dynamic of Sino-Indian relations under a scanner. The old paradigm of Sino-Indian relations, where the argument was that India and China can continue with their border negotiations, even as they keep on engaging with each other on trade, on culture, on people-to-people contacts, and other aspects of political relationship. That paradigm no longer operates today. India is making it very clear to the Chinese that boundary issue, that this conflict is going to be the central issue around which the larger Sino-Indian relationship would evolve. If it is not resolved amicably, then there are going to be serious repercussions for Sino-Indian relationship. And India has therefore across the board used lots of levers that it possibly thinks it has, including engaging with other like-minded countries, including banning Chinese apps, including trying to wall off China from strategic sectors in Indian economy, in Indian infrastructure. And I think that's an attempt to send a message to the Chinese that the situation is really serious. And to be frank, situation is actually very serious across the LAC. So as I said, it is at one level a question of Chinese rise, Chinese power differential with India. On the other hand, it is also a reflection of greater confidence within India that it can take on China. So in a sense, on the ground, India is not simply ceding ground. India is also gradually trying to maneuver militarily, so that right now India occupies a number of strategic mountaintops in areas where Chinese have encroached upon Indian territory. So the situation along LAC remains very, very volatile, because not only is China pushing from one side, but India is also responding in kind, or at least not willing to take it lying down. So I think that's the larger frame around which this conflict has evolved over the last few months since April, with India demanding a restoration of status quo ante as it existed in April, and China is not willing to budge on the ground.
Thank you, Harsh. And you mentioned that these tensions have spilled into other areas and into the economic sphere as well. Could you two give me your input on, what are the biggest areas where this conflict has spilled over to in terms of economic implications? So what kind of economic implications does this conflict have in India and China and the region? And if so, sort of what sectors are the most affected in this new competition? Bibhu, do you want to take this one?
Well, India started with banning the Chinese apps. It also took a large number of steps to prevent the Chinese companies from taking over stakes in the Indian companies. It banned import of Chinese items. It's ensured that the e-commerce sites report the country of origin. So if it's Chinese origin product, almost 90% of the things that are being sold, whether it's computers and washing machines, all stuff like plastic items, you name it, you have it, they come all from China. Now, the e-commerce sites are now under obligation to sort of share the country of origin, and then becomes India's choice whether to allow them or not. India also foresees itself as a beneficiary of companies withdrawing from China due to the COVID pandemic and relocating. So India hopes that it can also become an attractive destination for those kind of companies. So on a larger scale, India is trying to, as Harsh pointed out, is building pressure on China from multiple sides and hoping that you can't hurt China militarily. Probably there is no parity between the two sides. There can be debate on that. Till the war is fought, you never know who's stronger, who's weaker. But India is always in a position to sort of hurt Chinese economically. And that shows in Beijing's reactions to the Indian moves on banning of the apps, or the moves that directed mostly at the Chinese companies. So India is basically taking it into a larger frame to ensure that it's just not a military fight alone. It can be from other fronts to pressurize China to sort of concede to India's demands.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Harsh, do you agree with this?
Yeah, you see, I think the larger issue here is how India will navigate its relationship with China at a time when the border conflict, as I pointed out earlier, increasingly is going to be the central pivot around which this relationship is possibly going to evolve. And that's a message that India is sending out, that India is willing to bear some costs for it. That the whole idea that you can continue to trade with China, that you can continue to engage China on technology issues. For example, till last year, we had the situation where Chinese companies were allowed to take part in the 5G trials in India. That was the indication that India gave. Now today, I think the situation is completely changed. And now the idea there is that there is a larger reevaluation of India's China policy that is going on. And all the fronts that are available to India, India would like to use them. India would like to use all the leverage that it has. Economy is certainly one area where it feels that it has some leverage. It may not have a lot of leverage, but certainly some leverage if you are one of the biggest markets in the world at a time when markets in the West are collapsing, then certainly India can leverage that to its advantage. Now that's what it's trying to do. That's the signal it's sending. And that look, if you keep on pushing the border issue unilaterally, then it will have repercussions on the wider relationship. It will have repercussions on economic ties, and India will become more hardline in its approach on economic questions. The old paradigm that you can continue to, trade with China. China was till very recently India's largest trading partner. Those sorts of things I think have been subsumed by the larger reality on the ground, operational reality on the ground. So there is a lot of disenchantment with China that is now visible. That is visible at multiple levels. That is visible certainly at the level, at the street level, where people feel very anxious about the border situation. It is also very palpable at the strategic policy making level, where policymakers are trying to see what leverage they have. And economy certainly becomes one of those areas where they can do something, or at least visibly do something about it. Whether it will have an impact on Chinese thinking, that remains to be seen. I mean, there is no evidence that what India has done over the last few months has had an impact on Chinese thinking, or that they are in any way, buckling under some pressure that look, India is doing this, let's give in to some of India's demands. In fact, their position seems to be becoming even more hardened. So so I think it's a typical negotiation happening between two powers through the use of whatever instrumentalities are available to them. So on the one hand, you are trying to operationalize it on the ground with defense forces trying to maneuver around each other. On the other hand, you are trying to show to the Chinese that look, you have economic areas where India can emerge, where India can try to put some pressure. There is going to be technology dimension. Increasingly, India is trying to work with, or at least is underscoring its resolve to work with like-minded countries when it comes to 5G technology and other cutting-edge strategic emerging technologies. There is also the dimension of how do you look at global supply chains, supply chain resilience project with Japan and Australia that India is initiating is part of that attempt. So clearly at a broader level, India is trying to make a case to the Chinese that India is not alone at a time when other countries are also doing the same thing. Other countries are also trying to reevaluate their economic ties with India. And I think that's where India is trying to position itself as a country that perhaps can also leverage that wider global climate against China to its advantage.
Thank you. I'm curious, what sort of predictions do you all have for the immediate future and for the long term in the relationship between India and China and the regional security? If you could identify what you think is either the biggest factor or one significant player that people are not currently aware of that we should going forward. Bibhu, do you want to take this one?
Let me try to answer this slightly differently. Now, say if you perceive India's foreign policy towards China, India is certainly at some kind of a weaker ground, in the sense that things has come up at a time which couldn't have been worse for India. India is reeling under this COVID-19 pandemic. State of economy is not that fine. Its domestic peace and stability front is not doing fine. Its neighborhood policy is in shambles. And it's also not being able to generate the kind of support it thought it would against China. If it thought that it can sort of get firm commitments from nations around the world that they would stand in favor of India. That hasn't really happened. Countries have been very subtle in their responses. They have been sort of talking about diplomatic assurances, talking about both countries, India and China, using their diplomatic levels to negotiate and resolve it peacefully. Countries have sold weapon systems, arms, and ammunition to India, but that doesn't really count as support to India vis-a-vis China. What India is trying to leverage most on this thing is its growing alliance or growing partnership with the United States. As I say, United States, it's, I think, primarily to do with President Trump. India hopes, in spite of President Trump's unpredictability, sometimes he praises China and India, sometimes he accuses India of a lot of other things. If Trump, my reading is, if Trump loses the election, India loses a lot of leverage vis-a-vis China. India hopes that if it's on a weaker ground now because of all these factors, many of these factors also are applicable to China, which will keep China under check. What I mean by that is, if the COVID-19 pandemic is holding India sort of back, it's also holding China back to an extent. China is under enormous pressure from a lot of other countries. So India hopes that sort of these things will sort of produce a stalemate, if not a resolution to the conflict. So that's my take. In the coming months, at least we're looking at winter, and both armies are prepared to stay put at the border, weather the storms and the winter at enormous cost. So beyond the winter, probably things will evolve by the time the US president's election will be over. Probably we'll have a Trump back in the seat, or we'll have a new president. If that happens, if Trump goes, India loses a lot of leverage. And that will be, to my reading, will be to China's advantage.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point. Harsh, what parting insight can you give on a factor or player that we need to be aware of?
The relationship between China and India is structurally a competitive one. So I don't think that inherent competition will change, or that competitive rivalry will change. That it will remain a relationship that will remain very, very contested. And as India has also risen, India has also become more assertive um, in shaping its foreign policy, in articulating its worldview. It's very natural that you will have that contestation getting sharpened. You know, so long as China was the big country, China was the big party, and India was relatively meek. India was relatively, India was not responding to that challenge. It was fine. You know, China could shape that narrative. I think India today thinks it's in a position that it can articulate a worldview which is more assertive, more in sync with what it feels to be its global priorities. So I think that means that you will have a very you will have a relationship with China that is going to get increasingly contested, even with all the problems that COVID-19 is bringing to the fore. Now, COVID-19 poses enormous challenges to India. It also poses enormous challenges to China, and in some ways, the last few months have been extremely damaging for China's global profile. So I think what one should not underestimate is that how you almost see a rallying around the world against China. The kind of the changing discourse in the West, the changing discourse in the Indo-Pacific by major powers, countries like Australia, Japan, and some in the Southeast Asian landscape. That is in sync with the larger reality that India is not alone in this larger struggle with China. So I think what what one needs to look at or calculate or think about is possibly that the relationship between China and India, two of the major Asian powers, will become very contested, and it will shape the larger Indo-Pacific landscape very, very significantly. And I think countries will now have to decide how the global and regional balance of power emerges. We are already seeing discussions about the future of multilateralism, the future of technology evolution. When United States says that countries like India should be invited to G7, when United Kingdom calls for a coalition of democracies to develop 5G, the indications are very clear that the world is trying to figure out a response to China's rise and to China's aggression. How that shapes up, how that maps itself out, again, it's still not clear at this point. But I think the challenge, the threat, there is a certain clarity about it, and I think there is a certain clarity in the Indian context as well. That I don't think going forward, India will retain the sort of they were often India had refrained from making certain choices in the last few years. India refrained from making certain choices because it thought that by not making those choices, India might be assuaging Chinese concerns, and that might make China more amenable to India's concerns. When that has not happened, so what this border crisis has done is that it has clarified Indian responses in some ways. I think going forward, you would see greater coordination with like-minded countries. Like, for example, we are talking of making the Quad becoming more effective, this quadrilateral relationship between Japan, US, India, and Australia. We are going to look at greater hard power coordination, greater military exercises between major powers in the region, like-minded countries in the region. And I think that's the trajectory that India would like to pursue. That I think, given the challenge that it faces from China today, and given the border crisis, that clarity in Indian response perhaps is something that we need to look at. Even before COVID-19, even before this crisis, those who look at Indian foreign policy could make it out that that India was pursuing a certain trajectory vis-a-vis China with certain caution because of the capability differential. But certainly the trajectory was very clear that India was trying to balance China. And India has always tried to balance China given the limitations. I think going forward, it would be more overt balancing. And that is something that I think not only India should be prepared for, but I think at the very least, you will have the region should be prepared for, because that will have consequences for the way regional security architectures develop, regional security doctrines evolve, and the countries who might find themselves in the middle of this contestation might also have to make certain choices. So I think in that sense, India's response is forcing a certain clarity, not only in India's own role in the Indo-Pacific discourse, Indo-Pacific calculus, but also forcing other countries to make those choices very clear. And I think that is quite visible now from the West. That is quite visible now from countries like Australia and Japan. And it would be interesting to see how the larger landscape of ASEAN countries, for example, treats this question going forward, given their own challenge with China. But certainly what India is trying to do is to help, or is to try to get to a position where it can offer an alternative to regional states, to smaller states, at the same time fight its own battles with China. I think that that India will have to fight itself out, or India will have to fight its own battles, its own conflicts with China, is something that India will have to contend with, because I don't think we live in a world where countries are going to take overt positions against China. Countries, especially when it comes to bilateral border issues. India has also not taken such positions vis-a-vis other countries. So I think what we are looking at is a landscape where India will certainly try to make its policy positions and its operational positions clearer vis-a-vis China. At the same time, trying to leverage those countries, those organizations, those geographies where perhaps there is an opportunity for India to leverage a growing discontent vis-a-vis China. I think that perhaps is going to be the trajectory of Indian foreign policy, and perhaps also the regional security architecture.
Well, Harsh, Bibhu, I want to thank you so much for your insights and your time. I know the viewers really appreciate it. So thank you very much.